Hey, what's going on there guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at 4-color Delver for the Legacy format. So, Delver, as far as Legacy is concerned, is pretty much like the same deck that it is in Modern. It's a tempo-based deck that wants to just grind out your opponent as quick as possible by using all of its resources very efficiently, and while you're doing that, you're trying to keep your opponent from doing much and pretty much just keep them from actually establishing a win condition or even a threat. So with the deck, as you guys can see here, it's only 2 colors, but I did say it's a 4-color deck. I'm basically splashing black and green, black being a common thing where the blue-red Delver decks are just splashing black for Cabal Therapy in the sideboard. I decided to just kind of step it up a notch as far as splashing goes, and also splash green so that we're able to play some stuff in the sideboard like Ancient Grudge and be able to flash it back, as well as Krosan Grip as well. So, to actually start things off and talk about the cards that we have here, our first one is Delver of Secrets, so the kind of centerpiece of the deck. So, with Delver, we're basically building a deck that is heavy on instants and sorcery so that we can actually flip him. At the beginning of our upkeep, we can look at the top card of our library, we can reveal that card. If it's an instant or sorcery, we can transform him into his 3/2 flying Insectile Aberration form and just start bashing away. We have 4 Monastery Swiftspear, which is our 1/2 for 1 red pseudo-goblin guide for the deck. It has haste and also has prowess, so once we get a Monastery Swiftspear onto the battlefield, anything from that point, if we're getting into a counter war over like resolving a Young Pyromancer or like anything like that, just resolving Brainstorms, Ponders, Gitaxian Probes, and whatnot, our Monastery Swiftspear just gets on like a whole lot bigger. So it can protect itself well from cards like Lightning Bolt or even Fork Bolts that your opponent may have, which pretty much limits the amount of useful cards that your opponent can actually use to get rid of Swiftspear. But the Swiftspear is just like one of the easiest ways to just jam a bunch of spells in the turn when you know your opponent can't really block the Swiftspear, and then just get in for a whole lot of value. We have our 4 Young Pyromancer in the deck, so whenever we're casting instants and sorceries, we're getting an additional 1/1 onto the battlefield. So usually with Young Pyromancer, it's not a card that you just slam onto the table as soon as possible, like on turn 2. There's a little bit of strategy to actually playing the Young Pyromancer, like being able to play him and also protect him in a turn as well, or at least be able to like play him, and if your opponent tries to bolt him, like get at least like 1 or 2 activations off of the Young Pyromancer as well, whether that's like trying to counter with like Daze or something like that, or also be able to Daze Brainstorm. The Young Pyromancer is one of the best ways to just try to grind out games, and usually if we can resolve one late game and just keep on casting spells that draw us cards, we're pretty much just going to have the advantage over our opponent. The one Vendilion Clique that I have in the deck, the Vendilion Clique is not really something that a lot of Delver decks tend to play in the main board. It's more of a sideboard card. However, I like the Vendilion Clique a lot because it's just useful in a lot of different matchups, like the Sneak and Show matchups. It's also really useful against miracles because whenever your opponent reveals a miracle, it reveals out of the hand and the abilities put onto the stack. You can flash and click, you can click their hand and take their miracle and put it on bottom of their library so they don't actually get to use it. So the Clique has some interactions like that that are just really good for disruption, especially in the case of like combo decks and anything like that. But usually for the more unfair metas, I like to play the Vendilion Clique main board. Otherwise, it's just kind of useful to have like a True-Name Nemesis instead, or even if you're just like running into a meta that's huge on Delver, like another Fork Bolt is pretty appropriate for that as well. As for the rest of the spells that we're playing in the deck, it's pretty much kind of standard with all of the blue-red Delver decks. We're playing 4 Gitaxian Probe to be able to take a look at our opponent's hand and also draw a card for Phyrexian Blue. We have 4 Ponder, so we can look at the top 3, rearrange them. If we want to, we can shuffle our deck, but then we're going to draw a card, so pretty much we'll set up our Delver for us if we want, and otherwise we can get a shuffle out of it and draw a card either way. We have 4 Brainstorm to draw 3 and put 2 back, so useful whenever we want to set up a Delver during our upkeep. It's also Probably one of the more difficult cards to actually cast in this deck. There's a lot of thinking behind Brainstorm as far as like having a fetch land, brainstorming during your upkeep, and then cracking your fetch to shuffle your library and then draw for the turn. So there's a lot of different manipulation that can go on, like with the Brainstorm, especially whenever it comes to protecting yourself from a Thoughtseize or an opposing Vendilion Clique or something like that. So Brainstorm is extremely useful a whole lot of times for a lot of different interactions, but honestly, the more you keep on playing a deck like Delver, the more you seem to realize and come to acknowledge the different interactions the Brainstorm actually has, as we've just named a few. We have the 4 Treasure Cruise, which is just absolutely busted. We delve, we draw 3, it depowers Tarmogoyfs. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything to Nimble Mongoose, but depowering Tarmogoyfs is pretty awesome, and being able to just draw 3 for 1 blue is just extremely powerful. Now getting into our counter magic, we have 4 Daze. So the Daze, we can return an island to our hand instead of paying its mana cost, and we counter a spell unless its controller pays 1. So with the Daze, there's some matchups where it's just really good, and other matchups where it's just kind of terrible. Obviously, drawing a late game is not very good as well. There are a lot of times where I just kind of contemplate cutting Daze entirely and just play a Dazeless Delver deck. However, Daze does have a lot of like different matchups where you just want to have it and you want to stop your opponent from being able to just kind of like go off on turn 1, especially like if you don't have a Force of Will. So the Daze pretty much just ends up kind of being a necessity for these types of decks. As far as game 1 goes, game 2, game 3, you can make the judgment call of whether or not Daze is actually practical for you, and then you can sideboard appropriately. But we do have the 4 Daze for counter magic, as well as 4 Force of Will, which is just pretty much iconic for these types of decks. It's our hard counter that we have. We can exile a blue spell from our hand, as well as pay 1 life instead of paying its 5 cost, and we basically just counter a spell. The Force of Will, again, if you're playing up against a very, very fair deck, I really don't side the Force of Will out very much, but there are some just outlier instances where the Force of Will could be sideboardable out, and if you know that the meta is just absolutely huge on very fair decks like Death and Taxes and whatnot, then you can just kind of jam more things in your sideboard, like Pyrokinesis, that are just good up against those matchups. And like your Force of Wills can just turn into more actual creature hate and board hate for your opponent when you actually know that the meta is going to be that. As far as our burn spells and our last section of the deck goes, we have 4 Lightning Bolt to deal 3 to target creature or player, pretty much just like one of the most universal red cards that we have. 2 Forked Bolt, because it's just really good up against Delver right now. Just being able to distribute the damage between like a Young Pyromancer and one of the tokens or anything like that is just really, really good. There are some matchups where Forked Bolt comes out, so like if you're playing up against combo decks that aren't really playing any creatures or anything like that, the Forked Bolt can just side out for something like Cabal Therapy. But the Forked Bolt, it's run main board pretty much just because like Delver is pretty much a huge thing. And then 1 Pyroblast, which is a meta call for the most part. Counter target spell if it's blue, or destroy target permanent if it's blue. So the Pyroblast, if blue's really heavy in your meta, which it is in mine, and for the most part a lot of people have pretty much adapted to playing the 1 Pyroblast main board, it's just a good card to have as a one of, and then you can sideboard into more or side it out and side into less of them and play more appropriate things post board. So now it's time to actually talk about where our 2 other colors actually are and discuss our sideboard here. So for our sideboard, I'm playing 1 True-Name Nemesis, 1 Ancient Grudge, 1 Krosan Grip, a Grim Lavamancer, Electrickery, 2 Grafdigger's Cage, 4 Cabal Therapy, 1 Nihil Spellbomb, 1 Surgical Extraction, and 2 Pyroblast. So now let's talk about the implications for each card. So the True-Name Nemesis, I like this card a whole lot, especially up against like the other Delver decks. Whenever you're able to just side out the Vendilion Clique where you're not playing against a just completely unfair deck, you can set in the True-Name Nemesis, and it's one of those cards that like Electrickery won't hit even if it's overloaded, like Lightning Bolt won't hit it, Pyroblast won't hit it if our True-Name Nemesis is actually resolved and we've chosen our opponent as the player that we have protection from. So the True-Name Nemesis, I just like it a whole lot whenever I want one card to be able to grind out the matches, and my Vendilion Clique's a little bit softer to the removal than my opponent actually has. So that's where I like to and tend to side in the True-Name Nemesis. I have the Ancient Grudge for matchups like robots if it ever comes up, which it does here and there, but it's not really that huge. It's also good up against Painter as well, so the Imperial Recruiter Painter decks, and also up against Stoneforge decks. I love being able to side in the Ancient Grudge up against any deck that's running like 3-4 Stoneforge Mystics, and just be able to blow up their targets once they actually put them on the battlefield. Same thing with like Krosan Grip, pretty much for the matchups that I just named where we're setting in the Ancient Grudge. The Krosan Grip is also good for them, but the Krosan Grip also gives us an edge up against the Miracles deck as well, so being able to just blow up our opponent's stuff and not have them be able to try to lock us out and soft lock us in the Miracles deck is just really great. And the split second does make a huge difference, and it's one of the biggest reasons why I actually want to splash for the green, is to be able to play the Krosan Grip. As far as our Grim Lavamancer is concerned, it's pretty much for like the more grindy matchups, and also for the creature-based matchups like Death and Taxes and Elves as well. We have removal spread across numerous turns, and we can utilize our graveyard to be able to deal damage to our opponent. So our Grim Lavamancer ends up being a really good outlet at just taking apart what like Death and Taxes and Elves has as far as like really good creatures for them. And pretty much if we can't outrace our opponent, we can at least try to stabilize the board if they're trying to get explosive. But in the case of like something like Death and Taxes, if we're on the draw, they could have the potential of just getting a better board state than us. But for the most part, if we're on the play, we shouldn't have too much of a problem just outracing Death and Taxes. We have the one Electrickery, which is predominantly for matchups like Delver, but it's also useful up against Death and Taxes and Elves as well. While it doesn't hit every single creature in their deck, it does still do a pretty good job at getting rid of a lot of creatures, so the Electrickery is just pretty much good for like the Young Pyromancer decks predominantly. We have the two Grafdigger's Cage, which is good for like the Dredge decks, like Landless Dredge and just the regular Lion's Eye Diamond Dredge decks. It's also good for Storm and Elves as well. So those are like pretty much the bigger matchups where I like to side in the Grafdigger's Cage. Cabal Therapy is for like the combo decks and anything that's trying to just be very unfair. We can side in the Cabal Therapy over like the removal that we have, and just be able to pick away at our opponent and be able to name things that we know that they're playing in the matchups. The best thing about Cabal Therapy is actually just the fact that we can flash it back by sacking a creature, which if we have Young Pyromancer out, we get the activation, we sack one of our tokens away, and just like make another token off the Young Pyromancer anyway. So it's pretty useful with Young Pyromancer decks to be able to actually play the Cabal Therapy. As far as Graveyard Hate goes, we have the Nihil Spellbomb and the Surgical Extraction. So Nihil Spellbomb, I really like having this card as a sideboard tech for just the graveyard matchups in general, but it's also really good up against the Nimble Mongoose decks as well. So I like to be able to side in the Spellbomb against them just because it depowers their Tarmogoyf out of their own grave, and it also depowers their Nimble Mongoose as well. And then the Surgical Extraction is just kind of it's more universal. It's not strictly just for graveyard matchups. Like you can set it in against like the Delver decks if you're pretty much planning on playing a long matchup, and you can pick away at certain cards that they have. But it's good at like just kind of disrupting things like taking away Narcomoebas from like Landless Dredge, or taking away their Dread returns even more importantly. But like there are different things that the Surgical Extraction can do for like the more fair decks, or the decks that aren't specifically centered around combos that can just kind of break apart what they're trying to do. But for the most part, I find myself in a lot of matchups just siding the Surgical Extraction, just because I can take away like 1 or 2 cards from my opponent that are just really good for them after they've like cast one, or after I've like Cabal Therapy one away. And then I'm just pretty much able to shape the game from there on out. And then we have 2 Pyroblast. So the Pyroblast is for like the blue heavy decks. It's pretty much like another counter spell for blue spells that her opponent's casting, and it's also good at just blowing up permanents like Vendilion Cliques, Delvers that our opponents have, even like Jeskai Ascendancy if you're playing against that deck as well. But the Pyroblast, it pretty much just has narrow implication for the matchups that you're siding into, and for those matchups, it's usually just really, really good. So that is our deck tech and our deck list here for 4-color Delver, the very greedy blue-red variant that just goes for 1 more color over the typical black splash. So if you guys enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you thumbs up the video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering content. But until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and peace out.
If you guys want to keep up to date with everything that we have going on here at Absolute MTG, remember to hit that subscribe button, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter for all of your Magic the Gathering needs. Also, remember to check out our sponsors of the channel, MTG Madness and AVUgames.com. But as always, thank you guys for watching.